Hey, this is Professor Heimlich, trying a new software here to see if we can record lecture. It looks like I've got about 45 minutes with this software, so let's get to it. This week we're going to be going on Chapter 9, Abolitionists Black and White, excuse me, and we will be doing our very best to cover that here in the next 45 minutes. A brief summary, if you will, of the slavery crisis. Once again, you probably do want to have your slideshow pulled up so you can follow along. I will be skipping a few slides, specifically the third one, which is just a reference that you may want to read your textbook and reread it. But anyway, onward. The first bit is the Three-Fifths Compromise, which happened during the writing of the Constitution, giving each slave only three-fifths of personhood for the purposes of getting their census data and giving increased voting power to the South. There was the constitutional block on the banning of the international slave trade. Northwest Ordinance in 1787 limited slavery to the east of the Ohio River Valley. The Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Nullification Crisis of 1832, and the Gag Rule of 1836 to 1844, in which, during the Jackson administration, they attempted to ban any mention of slavery from happening on the floor of Congress, which we'll get to a little bit more later when we get to John Quincy Adams. Well, as we talk about the people that are against slavery, let's talk a little about the arguments for slavery, that it drove the economy and that it was a necessary evil, that the founding fathers condoned it by not banning it, which is true. They didn't ban it, and they put limits on banning even a singular tiny part of it. The Bible supports slavery in places, and America, especially in the South during the 19th century, is an incredibly religious Christian place, and the Bible is one of their chief tools for justifying their actions. Property rights. Property rights are enshrined in the Constitution. You have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right against unlawful search and seizure in the Constitution. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is originally coined as life, liberty, and property by John Locke. And that tells you that the pursuit of property is considered intermixed with the pursuit of happiness in general. The fact that it's just tradition in the South. The South has always had slavery, as far as they're aware, even though Georgia had only adopted slavery very shortly before the American Revolution, and they will always have slavery, in their opinion. And then there's the normal white supremacist the white supremacist argument that people of African descent are just inferior to whites and that they cannot take care of themselves. This is the slavery is a positive good argument, and the most vile, arguably, of the bunch. And unfortunately, kind of the most popular across the way. Tradition, again, kind of reaching, property rights, kind of reaching, Bible, kind of reaching, but white supremacy is something that anybody in 19th century America can understand. All right, you might want to read Thomas Jefferson's Case for Slavery, which is pages 147 through 151 on that topic. It's pretty crystal clear. And then there are the arguments against slavery. The Constitution allowed for the banning of international slave trade in 1808. The Constitution allows for the seizure of property under certain circumstances. If you commit crimes, if the military needs it, if the government needs it, they can seize property. So the whole argument that, well, I have property rights is kind of nonsense. Property can and is seized by the federal government under the right circumstances. The founding fathers thought slavery was going to disappear on its own. Kind of a wishy-washy argument. Certain founding fathers thought that, certain ones didn't. And to be quite clear, as I hopefully have been in this class, no one in America, quite frankly, gives a damn what the founding fathers thought if they disagree with you. And everyone just kind of says the founding fathers believed whatever they wanted them to believe. So that's not a very good argument. And lastly, basic human decency and morality, which you would think would be the best argument, but unfortunately isn't. And added to the list of four, the spoken argument against slavery, the one that nobody is debating, but the one that is the most influential, is that with cheap immigrant labor arriving from Europe, in a lot of these states, slavery is no longer necessary. It's no longer the peak way to get cheap labor. Taking advantage of immigrants and working them to death is the best way. So, slavery is, as we near the Civil War, slowly but surely becoming obsolete and becoming far more of a cultural thing, a thing that about preserving wealth and the existing cultural and power structure, rather than a economic benefit necessarily. All right. All right. So next, we're gonna get into the meat of this as we move along at a very good clip. The competing abolitionist methodologies, or why abolitionists do not get along. Abolitionists are not a monolith. They have competing ideas, they have competing values. Some are racist, some aren't racist. They have different methods of how they would like abolition to happen. I apologize for the shadow. I have the window over here providing a little bit more light, and there's just not a good room with great lighting for me to film this in. So, violent versus nonviolent. That one kind of speaks for itself. People like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and John Quincy Adams are strictly nonviolent. They believe that violence doesn't solve anything. It'll lead to reprisals, that it's not helpful, that it'll turn the racist but pro-abolition whites against the movement, though that changes over time, versus Henry Gurnett and John Brown, who are very violent, and Harriet Tubman, who we don't really know about violence. I'm sure that she probably did have to commit violence at some point, but mostly focused on helping people escape. And then there's immediate versus gradual. People like John Quincy Adams working through the government are perfectly fine with a slow, gradual, or Lucretia Mott or Elizabeth Cady Stanton are all kind of fine with a slow, gradual phasing out of slavery because they're white and they don't really feel too much of an immediate burning need to free the slaves. And your average African American abolitionists like Frederick Douglass or William Henry Garnett both want an immediate release, an immediate abolition of all slaves. And there's a lot of heated debate amongst these different groups. And then lastly, there's legal versus extra legal. Harriet Tubman and those who want violence oftentimes don't care and what happens, but John Quincy Adams, once again, is going to be going mostly through the law to try and use legal means to free slaves and would frown upon extra legal freeing of slaves. And again, that is the height of white privilege. If you are privileged and you are white, then you are fine with a slow, gradual, legal means of freeing the African Americans. But if you're black, that's probably not so much the case. There's just a little bit more of a sense of immediacy to free your people if you were in that situation. All right. Of the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass is by far the most important. He's a slave that won his freedom. He published 3 autobiographies, 2 before the Civil War and 1 after the Civil War. He's well-spoken, intelligent. He's a proponent of nonviolent abolition, again, thinking that violence was not the answer. However, after they passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, he flipped on that, basically believing that this had kind of been a masks-off moment for the federal government, and that now any means, violent or nonviolent, were now justified. He started carrying a gun and believed that it was the time. He worked very, very closely with William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, and he, very much being outspoken, charismatic, an author, a writer, proved to the white upper class that blacks could be as smart as whites and as approachable as whites, and kind of took a sledgehammer with almost everybody that he personally met and spoke with to this idea of white supremacy, and at least managed to change a lot of minds, people that had kind of fallen for like the lazy caricatures and created a very much more healthy impression of what it meant to be a human being, allowed African Americans to be part of that group for a lot of white people in the North and in the West in the 19th century. Couldn't be more important, but his arch nemesis and rival was a guy named William Henry Garnett. And the two men at one point did actually meet and attempt to debate, but their supporters were so loud and heated that a riot almost broke out, and they actually couldn't hear each other speak. And Garnett was the immediate and violent overthrow guy. He authored a pamphlet called Resist, and he had it sent all over the South, calling for slaves to rise up against the slave owners and murder them and win by violent revolution, no matter what the cost. And you can imagine how well the Southern landowners and aristocrats reacted to these calls for immediate and violent revolution. There was crackdowns. He also escaped slavery as a child, and he is one of the figures who was very much against the idea that women should have rights like blacks have rights, and broke the American Anti-Slavery Society. Our third famous abolitionist that we're going to touch on today is Sojourner Truth. She escaped from slavery in Ulster County, New York in 1826. Slavery had started being phased out in New York in 1799, but 27 years later, it's still only very slowly, very gradually being phased out. She's the first African American woman to win a court case against a white man. And she gave the speech that was called Ain't I a Woman, but the thing about it is that she was from a Dutch section of New York that still spoke primarily Dutch. So she would have sounded like a European, not like a classic black person. So when she made the speech, white Americans rewrote it to make her sound like she was a uneducated Southern woman by a third party, and that's so incredibly racist. It's unbelievable. Nonetheless, despite them doing that, it did work, and it did once again put another crack in the edifice of white supremacy and allowed people to free their minds from this whole idea that black people are not equal to white people and begin to resist white slave power in the United States. And during the Civil War, she actually helps to recruit free blacks for the Union Army when they get off their butt and decide to start, allowing them to serve, which we'll get to next time. Next, we have Harriet Tubman, the famous Harriet Tubman, one of the architects and leaders of the Underground Railroad. She escaped from slavery in 1849. She guided slaves without fail to the North. She never lost one. She was never caught. She always managed to succeed. And when the Fugitive Slave Act is enacted, she actually has to start bringing slaves all the way to Canada because of the risk of the slave trackers basically hunting them down, even if they escaped to the North where slavery was banned. What fewer people know is that she also was a contemporary and in contact with the infamous John Brown, and helped him plan his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, scouting out the place for him, helping him find him maps and contacts in the area, and basically allowing him to attempt his great slave uprising. Next, we have William Lloyd Garrison. He was a white journalist from Massachusetts. He was partnered with Frederick Douglass. He's the one who basically discovered Frederick Douglass. He was the manager who put him in contact with upper society and promoted Frederick Douglass all the time. He founded a number of anti-slavery newspapers, the most famous of which is one called The Liberator. He also helped to found the American Anti-Slavery Society, which would collapse when they began supporting women's suffrage as well. Blacks and whites being equal is one thing, but men and women, no. That was a little bit beyond where even people that had figured out that white supremacist was kind of nonsense were willing to go. He supported a non-violent immediate emancipation of all slaves, like Frederick Douglass did. Again, very similar, very closely working together for the most part. And he supported women's suffrage before and after emancipation. Was generally a pretty good dude who believed that all human beings should have equal rights and be treated as human beings, which is a crazy thought given the time period. There's also former President John Quincy Adams. So one of the charges oftentimes leveled at John Quincy Adams was that when he was president was that he was pro-Native American because he wanted to actually abide by the treaties there, and that he hated his fellow whites, and he was secretly a closet abolitionist. Well, the broken clock is actually right twice a day. And it turns out when John Quincy Adams enters Congress after serving as president, because back then when you were president, it didn't mean when you were done being president that you just disappeared into the bushes, never to be seen again. You actually continued being in political life a lot of the time, and he was elected to Congress. And when the Southern states and Andrew Jackson began to censor the mail to stop abolitionists from being able to use it, John Quincy Adams led the charge to make sure that Congress rejected the notion. It was a wild abuse and violation of the First Amendment. And I'm sorry, moving the camera around. I'm on a netbook. So, Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's close friend and ally, who was a New York elitist, not a Southerner, even though he did everything the South ever wanted, attempted to actually ban anti-slavery petitions in the Senate, which is called the gag rule, which we had mentioned before. Well, if we can't stop them from using the mail, we'll just stop any and all mention of slavery in Congress. And Adams makes a mockery of the rule in Congress. He would say things like, "I have here 3 letters from South Carolina," and everyone would be like, "Shut up, John Quincy Adams. We know you're up to some kind of trickery, and this has to do with slavery, doesn't it?" He'd be like, "Yes, it does." And they'd be like, "Then we have the gag rules in place. You're not allowed to say that." He said, "But senators from South Carolina, don't you want to hear this letter from some young lady constituents from your state?" And then they'd be like, be intrigued, be like, "Okay, John Quincy Adams, I'll bite. What is it?" And it turns out that it's a series of letters from young black women who were freed in South Carolina. And there'd be an uproar. How dare you say that black women are ladies? And talk about slavery. There's a gag order in place. And eventually, they try to censor him and throw him out of the House of Representatives. But unfortunately, that's kind of his trap. Because when they put him on trial, he put slavery on trial. Day after day, week after week. Until eventually Jackson and Martin Van Buren tell Congress, "Shut up, you're giving him a giant megaphone and a giant platform." And that is when John Quincy Adams earns from Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson the title of the acutest, the astutest, and the archest enemy of Southern slavery that ever existed. Andrew Jackson also called him a madman because he felt that by pointing out that slavery is wrong and fighting for the Northern right to not have slavery, he was putting the entire Union at risk of civil war, rather than, maybe the South should keep their slavery to themselves. He also, during his time in Congress, put his entire career on hold when a ship full of slaves was being smuggled into the United States illegally. Had a uprising, and they took themselves over and they attempted to get their freedom, and the Southerners sued to stop them from getting it, and he actually went and won the case for them pro bono to win them their freedom. John Quincy Adams, much better guy after being president than when he was president. If only he could have been maybe, I don't know, the president when he discovered he was an abolitionist. and pressed, used his power as the most powerful, his power as the most powerful man in America to battle slavery and maybe stop the South from consolidating power as much as they did during the earlier decades of the 19th century. All right. Next, we have John Brown. He's a white guy born in Massachusetts, and he was a religious zealot. I believe that God wanted him to destroy the institution of slavery with a sword, with violence, through personal means, war, a crusade against racism and against bigotry and against the vile practice of slavery. He believed that blacks and whites were truly equal, which definitely helped to earn him the reputation of being a crazy person. He is one of the bloodiest militants in the Bleeding Kansas incident. Most famously, him and two of his sons went into a white slave-owning aristocrat's house, murdered him and his entire family in their beds while they slept with swords. He plans and executes a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, try and seize thousands of firearms to arm the slaves for a slave insurrection in Virginia, starting in modern-day West Virginia, where there was a much stronger anti-slavery, pro-abolitionist sentiment, and basically take that show on the road and fight a literal crusade, house to house, to wipe out the slave owners and free the slaves. Brave man, violent man. He is executed for his troubles, and that is a major event, actually, in the history of abolitionism, which we'll get to once again in a little bit. And lastly, there's Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They do not have a slide here. This was part of me making sure that people read the text and watch and go to class and watch the lectures. Lucretia Mott is a Quaker from Pennsylvania and an outspoken early feminist supporter of women's rights, though not of women's right to vote, weirdly enough. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another powerful woman in the women's rights movement, founder, and they were also members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and felt also assisting with women's rights as well as enslaved were Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. Both of them were very important individuals. Well, William Lloyd Garrison, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all went to London for an international abolitionist conference, because even the Europeans saw American slavery and realized that it was way over the line, that it was an evil that had to be destroyed. And when they went to London for this conference, the abolitionists in London banned women from speaking or attending the conference on the conference floor. And William Lloyd Garrison actually refused to speak at the conference. He actually went up to the gallery with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and sat it out and refused to participate, because what's the point of freeing the slaves if women also aren't allowed rights? The whole point of the exercise that all human beings should have equal rights, equal representation, and what is this garbage about only men count? It's ridiculous. Well, this becomes a major scandal amongst abolitionist circles, with William Henry Garnett being like, we have to free the slaves now. There's no time to deal with this feminist stuff. The women aren't being whipped and separated from their families and abused like black people are. Put things in perspective. What are you doing grandstanding and risking fracturing the movement, and it turns into a real battle, and the movement breaks apart. The American Anti-Slavery Society starts fracturing in 1838, and by 1839, when it is gone, G-O-N, gone. The G-O-N-E-I, it's a joke. I have to say that because it's for posterity, and women's liberation and women's rights sets back the abolitionist movement as it breaks into different groups based on not just violence versus nonviolence, illegal action versus legal action, immediate abolition versus gradual abolition. But the straw that breaks the camel's back of this coalition is women's rights. When the Seneca Falls Conference happens a decade later in 1848, though, the only African American in attendance who makes a big, rousing speech, not just in support of women's rights, but specifically women's suffrage and the women's right to vote, is Frederick Douglass. William Lloyd Garrison also involved and helping with pro women's rights newspapers and media and networking. Ironically, him and the two of them and Elizabeth Cady Stanton find themselves on the opposite side of the argument from Lucretia Mott, who, while a great female orator, there are not many of them because women are largely kept completely removed from public speaking roles or politics outside of the Quaker tradition, which Lucretia Mott is a Quaker. But she doesn't believe in women's right to vote. Again, very strange. The kind of thing that only happens in the 19th century, really. But yeah, you find the abolitionist movement has serious problems getting over its own basic ideologies, sexist, racist, and so on. It's a very, very hard times. Around this time, around the time of the Seneca Falls Conference, you have a new threat to abolitionism, though, and that is the Free Soil Party. The abolitionists were fighting to stop the gains from the Mexican-American War, which we've touched on a little bit. Basically, when Texas broke free, there was a question as to which river, the Rio Bravo, the Rio Nueces, was the correct river, the correct quote-unquote Rio Grande in the treaty. A skirmish happens. America uses that as an excuse to invade. We use a bunch of crappy militias that rape and pillage, and a third of them die from Montezuma's revenge, i.e. diarrhea from drinking tainted water, because of course they did. The militias are always useless, and everyone who is anyone in the American Civil War were there as part of the actual smaller, regular military contingent, and they annex New Mexico, Arizona, California, most of the Southwest and East, and other than California, most of it is slated to become slave states, which the North and the Northeast did not want, but they did it anyway, naturally. However, they're trying. The abolitionists are trying to block these states from becoming slave states because the more Senate votes that the South gets, the more the more power and the longer abolition will take to happen. And in 1848, they create the Free Soil Party, which basically takes a slightly gross white supremacist turn. Basically, instead of saying that whites and blacks are equal or slavery is wrong, they say the land in the West should go to white people, not rich plantation owners. And do we really want more blacks in larger portions of the country? And they win many seats in the House of Representatives and one Senate seat, though they lose the presidential race terribly. And this isn't a threat to abolition necessarily because, it is an abolitionist party that's blocking it. The problem is that they're making this hard pivot, leaning into white supremacy and racism rather than trying to eliminate it, as well as activating a certain class struggle, rich aristocratic white Southerners versus like more middle class, lower class Northern whites. And that'll backfire with the Know Nothings and the like, where the white supremacy, instead of being harnessed towards a pro-abolition, pro-black person stance, will become harnessed in an anti-abolition and anti-black person stance. It turns out that dealing with racism is fruit of the poison tree, and you don't want to do it. It'll backfire. Weird. The Know Nothings basically are what you get, or if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, this idea that the quote-unquote native whites whose families have been around since colonial times are better and different than the immigrants. And they also target black folks. And as the abolitionist movement, as I said, is pivoting into this more racist, more white supremacist guise, the Know Nothings basically begin to try and hijack it. And it basically destroys the Free Soil Party, which leads in 1854 to the birth of the Republican Party. Tired of compromise. Tired of leaning into white supremacist arguments. The Republican Party is a coalition of disaffected Northern and Western Democrats who are tired of just bending over and doing everything the Southern Democrats want because they're the bankrollers. They're the people who really control the party, along with the remnants of the Whig Party, which has risen and fallen with no real strong result. And they have three main things that they are going for. They're going for infrastructure, basically the American system. It was a good idea then; they consider it a good idea now, which is where they're getting their moneyed interest from, is from their desire to continue the American system. Two, education. As factory jobs and like happening, there's a greater need for educated people. It doesn't bring quite as much money as the infrastructure portion, but it also is something that everyone can agree on. Nobody thinks that they want their kids to be less educated, other than people who obsessively watch Fox News nowadays, but that's a relatively recent phenomenon. And then there is anti-slavery, and it is definitely the third and least important on the Republican docket of the three things they stand for. Those that believe that abolition and anti-slavery should be much more important become known as the radical Republicans, their own little distinct subsection of the Republican Party that will be the main driving force in Congress behind abolition and getting rid of slavery. As all this is going on, there becomes a spiral of violence, not just like civil unrest, but also physical violence in the Capitol. Most infamously, the murder of Charles Sumner, leader of the radical Republican caucus within the Republican Party, in the Capitol, following their electoral victories in 1854, 1856. He basically goes on the floor of the House and says, the Southerners want to rape the gains of the Mexican-American War. And they're like, excuse me? The R-word? Like, we've talked at length this class about how white Southern men take advantage of black Southern women. And he used that R-word, and that kind of triggers the Southern senators and House members. He accuses a senator named Butler of wanting slavery so badly so he could continue to rape black women, and that one of the reasons why Southerners love slavery so much is so that they can rape black women. This, again, triggers them even worse. He is beaten to death on the floor of the Senate, the floor of the House, by Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, with the guy's cane. He's from South Carolina, naturally, because every one of these degenerate slave owners that's like infamous, almost all of them come from South Carolina. They're kind of the ringleaders of the Southern cause. Brooks is actually censored and tossed out, but not tried for murder, because murdering a man for trying to get rid of slavery is justifiable homicide as far as the House of Representatives is concerned. And they re-elect him in South Carolina, and then they send him hundreds of new novelty canes to celebrate his murder of an abolitionist on the floor of the House. And you can imagine that this pisses the Northerners and the abolitionists right off. And then right on the heels of that comes the Dred Scott decision of 1856. Infamous decision. A slave's owner physically moves into a territory that is distinctly outlawed slavery. If you live in a state that has outlawed slavery and you're a slave, then you should be freed. So Dred Scott sues, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that no, not only does Dred Scott not get to be free, but that black people don't have rights, can't have rights, are not U.S. citizens, and that basically slavery is legal everywhere in the entire United States. And oh boy, does that set the world alight. Abolitionism becomes much more mainstream. The fury of the North and the West is everywhere, and the South is like, how dare you try to violate our rights to practice our laws in your states in violation of your laws? Can't you see how much you're oppressing us by making us follow your laws in your states? Yeah. And then partially in response to this, within 3 years later, between October 16th and October 18th, 1859, the last thing we're going to go over this week, the raid at Harper's Ferry. John Brown and his sons, at it again, gather a posse. They sneak into Harper's Ferry. They get guns. They try to arm the slaves to escape. Robert E. Lee, someone who's going to be very important when we talk about the Civil War here in a week or so, leads the Virginia militia. They surround the armory. They stop him. He is captured and he is executed, along with his chief conspirators. But the thing that happens here that makes this so different from all the other rebellions, other than the fact that it was a white guy doing it, and that he actually genuinely was a kind of a crazy person who believed that God was speaking to him. Though, again, slavery evil as it is, he's got a pretty good case that that's the kind of thing God might not like if there is such a thing. Anyway, when he dies, rather than it being like, oh God, black people are being violent to white people, that's so wrong, he gets funeral honors in the North, an outpouring of grief, people wearing black, celebrations of his life, 20-gun salutes by some state militias. He has the largest funeral outpouring since the death of George Washington in certain parts of the country. And the South realized at this point that they have totally lost the rest of the United States. And this is one of those moments where it kind of cements the sides of who's going to be in the Civil War and why. And it is a real hardening of the sentiments. Previously, in any other time before the Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision, we're within 9 years of each other, John Brown probably would have been vilified as insurgent, as a crazy person. He's crazy. God talks to him. But no, he's a hero, a martyr in the North and in certain parts of the West. And it shows now that what people imagine the North was like is like, that you're taught in your textbook, has finally started, at least partially, to become 2 years before the Civil War begins. All right, we've beaten the 45-minute window before this video software basically collapses. Please go to the discussion section, answer the questions for this week, do your homework, and do note that your papers are due here in a week or so. I want to say it's the week after next. I'm going to double check here for you. I apologize for not knowing 100%. I'm having a little bit of a brain fart. I'm trying to use a new recording software that isn't just me talking into my cell phone and then recording it, and I'm not really willing to pay the hundreds of dollars for the highest quality video recording software so I can use it for about a month and then possibly never touch it again. Alrighty, so looking at the syllabus, what's coming up? A quick announcement while I'm looking that up. We're going to be going to a pass, minus, withdraw, fail system because of all the crazy stuff that's happening this semester. So that'll be new and interesting. Other than that, in terms of strangeness, weirdness of what's going on, here we go. One moment as I pull up the timeline here for you. Okay. The paper is due on the 15th. So you have about 2 weeks after this to get it done. It is 15% of your grade. It's very important. Also, obviously we can't do an in-class exam this week. So if you would like, as part of your discussion for this week, why don't you put on, and this is a reward for those who actually watch the lecture all the way through, why don't you put on there your opinions on what form you would like the final exam online version to actually be. And I will take it under advisement while I plan the thing. My one rule is no matching and no extra, no matching and no multiple choice. Anything else is kind of on the table. So, with that being said, thank you all for watching this week's essay, video essay and lecture, and I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful week.